Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paweł Lewicki. I'm the Associate Director of the European Studies Center. I would like to welcome you to today's session of our lecture series Europe Today, sponsored by the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh and Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies at University of Pittsburgh. Today's speaker is Karolina Follis. Karolina is a political anthropologist and senior lecturer at the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University in the UK. Her research focuses on politics of borders in Europe, in particular the contestations over security, entitlements to public services, and the rights of migrants and asylum seekers. Her current project, the Wellcome Trust-funded Doctors Within Borders, is an international networking initiative to bring together researchers, activists, and healthcare professionals interested in the healthcare entitlements of migrants, asylum seekers, and other patients who have unsettled legal or social status. She has worked on borders policing and cross-border movements between Poland and Ukraine, on the contradictions of bordering in the Mediterranean Sea, and on technologies of vision and security at EU borders. She is also trained in international human rights law and has explored the uses of human rights discourses and instruments in international pro-migrant advocacy. She is the author of several publications on the EU border regime in journals such as the Journal of Human Rights, Science, Technology, and Human Values, and the Journal of Civil Society, as well as the monograph under the title Building Fortress Europe, the Polish-Ukrainian Frontier, that was published at the University of Pennsylvania Press. After the talk, so the title of her talk today is A Tale of Two Borders, Lessons from the Differential Enforcement of the Polish-Belarussian and the Polish-Ukrainian Frontiers. After Karolina's talk, we will have a short Q&A round. So you have the possibility to ask questions in this little Q&A box in Zoom, and I will include these questions in our conversation. Thank you, Karolina, once again for joining us today and for accepting our invitation. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to you, Karolina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paweł, and thank you for this extensive introduction. It was interesting to hear my own bio. Thank you. So it is a pleasure to speak to you today. I am putting up my slides, and I hope what you're seeing, should be seeing the first one. Yeah. Does that look all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have the title. So I'll go straight ahead to this map that's going to situate us geographically. So this talk is about the responses of Polish authorities and civil society to the arrivals of refugees from the Middle East, South Asia, and African countries on Poland's border with Belarus. That arrivals that started in 2021 went on through 2022 and really to some extent continue to today. So that's one kind of aspect of this talk, and the other is the arrivals of Ukrainians fleeing the war in Ukraine, who began to arrive in Poland from February 2022 onwards. And so what we have to say is that the first of these groups encountered hostility. And it's not going to be an exaggeration to say that the second one was welcomed with open arms. And I can tell you right away that I don't think there is any contradiction in these responses. And instead, I see them as symptomatic of larger developments in Polish and European border and migration politics. And these are developments which I hope to flesh out for you. But I want to start with sort of methodological note / acknowledgement. And so this talk, just to let you know what it's based on, it's based mostly on my research with secondary sources, especially on the published firsthand accounts of reporters, activists, and researchers who traveled to Poland's eastern border in 2021 and 2022 and who live locally. And I want to acknowledge especially the activist collective called Grupa Granica, the border group, and another one that's called Badacze I Badaczki na Granicy, which means researchers on the border, and the independent news and fact-checking portal called Oko Press. And these are some of the key actors who documented and analyzed the events of the past 18 months on the border. And in many cases, they have done all that while providing humanitarian aid and advocacy on work on behalf of people who would have otherwise been left to die. So, I acknowledge their work in the sense that it's been a source for me, but I also, acknowledge it in the sense of thanking them for their amazing contribution. And I should also say, for further context, that as recently as last week, 16th of February, the border group reported that new human remains continue to be found in the forest in the zone adjacent to the Polish side of the border. People have died there as a result of hypothermia, thirst, hunger, injuries. And it is important to remember that even though the media no longer regularly report on the Poland-Belarus border, a slow humanitarian emergency continues to unfold, as there are effectively no safe routes for safe and legal passage into Europe. Many refugees continue to use the Belarusian route into the European Union, in spite of the fact that the Polish authorities push them back, and in spite of the fact that the border has been thoroughly militarized. So moving on to the outline of this talk, in a nutshell, I'm going to give you a brief account of the events of the past 18 months, both before and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I will try to situate these events within the longer history of the past 20 years on the border. And I'm interested in kind of taking a step back and thinking about EU border governance and its inherent tensions, and how a certain model of bordering Europe and bordering in Europe, which I am calling the technocratic model, that it has now been exhausted. And if it has been exhausted, then, what might be replacing it? So the border between Poland and Belarus came under the radar as a site of intensified irregular crossings in the summer of 2021. By September of 2021, and you have a little timeline on the slide, the Polish authorities introduced a state of emergency in the zone adjacent to the border in response to what they described as a rapid increase in illegal border crossings from Belarus to Poland. And the cause was quickly identified as blackmail by the Belarusian dictator, Alexander Lukashenko. Earlier that summer, the European Union imposed sanctions on the Belarusian economy in response, and I'm going to quote here from the press release of the Council of the European Union. The quotes were the sanctions were in response to the escalation of serious human rights violations in Belarus and the violent repression of civil society, democratic opposition, and journalists, as well as the forced landing of Ryanair flight in Minsk on 23rd May 2021, and the related detention of journalists Roman Protasevich and Sofia Sapega. So this was the reason. The sanctions were targeted. They involved prohibition on the sale of strategically important goods and technologies to Belarus. They restricted access to EU capital markets. And Lukashenko responded to that in turn by manufacturing a border crisis to pressure the EU into dropping the sanctions. How did he do that? Well, it's been documented that Belarusian security services engaged overseas travel agents and chartered flights to facilitate travel from the Middle East and other locations to Belarus, so as to direct people towards the border. And, there's a lot of reporting on that. One significant location was Iraqi Kurdistan, from where people were trying to get to the EU via Belarus, where people felt that this was the way that it was worth essentially spending the money and taking the risk of traveling that way, given that all the other irregular routes into Europe have been either cut off or have become just too perilous. So people would come to Belarus, they'd be directed towards the border, and essentially sent on their way to enter Europe. So Polish authorities and later key figures in Brussels essentially described this as an act of hybrid warfare. And so Polish, European, NATO actors said that what Lukashenko was doing was weaponizing migration to attack Poland and the EU. And so the image that you see on the slide is one illustration of the dehumanizing effect of this rhetoric. So there was this, the image comes from the territorial defense units, and it juxtaposes migrants, who were almost always portrayed as male and brown, right? Who came to be a synonym of threat, of a criminal, by definition, someone whose cross-border movements are illegitimate. And that would be opposed to refugees who would be portrayed as white and female and who may deserve a measure of compassion and hospitality. So the migrants were kind of a priori decided to not be deserving of humane treatment. And indeed, the people then arriving at the Belarusian border, even though, of course, they were not just men, there were men, women, children, families. They were and continue to be referred as Lukashenko's weapons, his soldiers, or even Putin's weapons, based on the logic that the Russian president's interests are aligned with those of Lukashenko. And a further extension of that is that then human rights activists who advocated for and assisted the people arriving via Belarus would also stand accused, especially, by right-wing online trolls, but also by some politicians. They're accused of aiding and abetting none other but Vladimir Putin himself. So somehow, the act of supporting people arriving at the border is like aiding and abetting Putin. When they drew attention, these activists, the human rights activists, when they drew attention to pushbacks and other violations of human rights on the border, they were accused of spreading Russian disinformation. I could just as well say this in the present tense because this is still unfolding. So instrumentalizing refugees as a tool of aggression or intimidation is, of course, nothing new. And other leaders like Gaddafi and Erdogan have seen and exploited the European Union's divisions in this regard very recently. And so Polish authorities decided to lean into this game, and they rolled out like a full-on military response and war rhetoric. And so here on the slide, we have a quote from the Prime Minister, Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, who offered a fine sample this war rhetoric when he declared, this was in November of 2021, so really at the height of this crisis, that the security and integrity of our borders is being brutally attacked and tested. And he goes on to place the blame on Lukashenko, accuse him of using the people as live shields, and it is his responsibility to remove them, to send them back to their countries where they belong. So throughout the autumn and winter of 2021-2022, there were thousands of men, women, and children who attempted entry into Poland, only to find themselves repeatedly pushed back to Belarus, and by and large, they were refused access to asylum procedures. So they would often end up abandoned in the deep forest between two hostile states. And I've taken this shot from Google Earth to kind of try to convey the density of the forest, the primeval forest in that borderland. Like, there really is very little infrastructure of any sort there, and it is a deep forest. So yeah, and because as the Polish border guard would push people back to Belarus, Belarusian authorities on the other side would not admit them back either. So they would kind of become stuck in this no man's zone between the two states. And the humanitarian, so like I said, the peak of this humanitarian crisis was around November, but in February of 2022, so about a year ago, activists from the border group were still reporting that about between 50 to 70 people per week, still need assistance. And all of that was happening in the shadows of the construction of a new border fence, which was then completed in June of 2022. And in the meantime, of course, as you will all know, on the 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine. And almost immediately after that happened, some 450 kilometers to the south, at checkpoints along Poland's border with Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees began to arrive daily, admitted with minimal bureaucracy, and welcomed by citizen volunteers and by public authorities. And so I will come back to that. But let me now sort of take a step back for a second and make a more general point about the European border regime. So what do I mean by the European border regime? It's a fairly vague, maybe idea, and different people have used it in different ways. What I mean by it here is this awkward assemblage of EU and national border and migration policies, actors and tools that have their roots in the justice and security cooperation between EU member states that goes back to the Maastricht Treaty. So over the years that preceded the EU eastward enlargement in 2004, EU member states agreed, notably at the summit in Tampere in Finland in 1999, that they agreed that in order to realize this vision of the European Union as an area of freedom, security, and justice, free from internal borders, right, the Schengen Agreement, they would have to strengthen the external borders and develop a common asylum and immigration policy. And the history of these efforts is kind of long and winding, and it's outside the scope of this talk. But there are 2 points that are important for our purposes. And the first point is that the preparedness to protect Europe's external eastern borders was one of the key criteria when candidate states that eventually joined the EU in 2004 when they were being assessed whether they are ready to join. So Poland's stretch of the border was going to be particularly long, and the Polish authorities took this task very seriously. And by the mid-2000s, they prided themselves on having built, cutting-edge capacities to ensure the integrity and the security of Poland's eastern border that was now the frontier of the European Union. And the second important point about the European border regime is that the EU does indeed have a common European asylum policy, which involves legislative instruments, common database for the identification of asylum applicants. It involves the European Union Agency for Asylum, but beyond that, the regulation of immigration is a national competence, and member states are generally protective of their sovereign rights to determine whom they want to admit to their territory. Now, similarly messy is the issue of actual border protection, right? The early fantasies of, there were some early fantasies in the, post-Tampere era of that there would be a common EU border force. But that never came to pass. And Frontex, instead what we have is Frontex, the EU External Border Agency. And it does play a role in border crises, and that is, but it is contingent on its arrangements with the relevant national governments, member state governments. So this is already a very complex set of arrangements, but it has been under significant strain since especially 2015, when the policies and practices of EU member states on the external borders of the European Union, when they came under public and political scrutiny for the first time on a really large scale. Right, so 2015, many of you will know about this very well, was the year of kind of unprecedented refugee arrivals, particularly from Syria, but also from North Africa, across the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea, and resulting in very large numbers, over 1 million people arriving in Europe that year. So I'm speaking to you from the UK, so the pictures on this slide are UK examples, but the picture was quite similar across Europe. And that was that some politicians and publics questioned the effectiveness of Europe's borders in stopping unwanted movement into Europe. They didn't like migration. They didn't want migration. They were skeptical of the claims that the people who were arriving were refugees needing protection. They saw them more as economic migrants. They didn't like seeing the images of arriving boats or the images of the thousands of people trekking along the Balkan route. So what they saw was a fortress Europe that was not repressive enough, given that it allowed over 1 million people to arrive just within 1 year. And these groups have been driving a politics of control and the kind of discourses and practices of hardening the borders. But then there were others, we can call them migrants' rights advocates, who were focused on the suffering of asylum seekers and on the fact that people were dying at sea. They didn't approve of the fact that people fleeing war and misery received this hostile reception in the EU. And this was the side of European public opinion that argued for a more welcoming Europe, right? Questioning the methods of EU border enforcement, especially in light of clear evidence that EU-supported policies contributed directly to the deaths of migrants at sea and human rights abuses in Libya. So early in the last decade, this side in the debate had some limited traction in pressing for a more humanitarian approach to border crises, such as, for example, in 2013 and 2014, when the Italian government deployed its naval assets to patrol the Mediterranean and to bring seaborne migrants to shore. But let's just say that the idea of a humanitarian border is an oxymoron, and many border scholars like Paolo Cutita or Polly Pallister-Wilkins and others have shown that really quite well in recent years. So this kind of summary of the two sides in the debate is, of course, a bit simplified. There was and there is, of course, a range of much more nuanced views on how borders should or could operate. But these main clashing currents reflect, and I'm referencing here Didier Fassin, the anthropologist, who has put it quite memorably, where in a piece written in 2005, that there are enduring tensions between the politics of compassion and the politics of repression in European border and asylum politics. And in that sense, what's been happening since 2015 is not really new. We know that after 2015, the pendulum swung hard towards repression. Member states went from kind of some limited financing of search and rescue operations at sea to embracing the idea that the very presence of NGO rescue vessels is in itself a pull factor for migration, and therefore it needs to be banned. There is rigorous academic research, thinking here of the work by Cusumano and Villa from 2019. This shows there is no such relationship, that the fact that there are rescue vessels at sea does not in itself attract more migrants to come. But academic research be damned, this is right now a very firmly entrenched kind of policy view in many European capitals. But I want to argue that even as these conflicts were becoming increasingly visible and also, electorally significant, having an impact on the fortunes of particular political parties that advocated this repressionist positions, and this has been happening since the middle of the last decade or even earlier in the domestic politics of member states. Even so, for the past 20 years, the European Commission and its Justice and Home Affairs agencies, especially Frontex, have been sort of engaged in an effort to mask these tensions by working hard to depoliticize borders, right? To erase or to at least downplay the fact that border control is an inherently antagonistic endeavor. And so, how have they been achieving this depoliticizing effect? Well, this was achieved by representing borders as, above all, objects of technical intervention and expertise. And for that purpose, the policy community at the supranational EU level devised this concept of border management, which you'll find it in many relevant policy papers, which officially refers to the structures and practices that, quote, encompass both security and facilitation of legitimate cross-border flows of people and goods. And this is a clean formulation that's embraced as I said, in these documents and frontex communications and by some of the more technocratically minded politicians. And it projects this idea that the exclusionary effects of European border policies can somehow be achieved in a neutral, business-like manner without violating fundamental rights and kind of without getting your hands dirty. And this is what I referred to in the beginning as the technocratic model of border control. And what I would suggest is to think, about it as a kind of, as this supranational paradigm that seeks to impose order and governability onto the fundamentally exclusionary and therefore violent sphere of border control. But of course, given the symbolic importance of borders to the dominant conceptions of statehood, depoliticizing borders was never going to be easy. And so, apologies for the self-promotion here, but I want to mention here something I wrote about in my book on the transformation of Poland's eastern border into an external border of the European Union following Poland's accession in 2004. So one of the interesting tensions I captured was between the perception of the border as a key site of national security on the one hand, and as a subject of EU governance on the other. So I had these informants in the Polish border guard, and as I talked to them, at the time, they were quite excited to have access to all the new technology, equipment, and training that they were getting to prepare them for this new role as guardians of the EU border. And you can see, this image on the slide. Oops, not this one. This image on the slide. How this was imagined at the time. It never, or at least not until 2022, it hadn't materialized in that way. So up until 2022, there was no fence on Poland's border with Belarus, and there isn't a fence now on Poland's border with Ukraine. But this idea that there could be these towers, fences, surveillance cameras, motion sensors, some of those things were installed there right in the beginning. Others, like I said, never materialized. But so all of that was welcome, and there was a lot of excitement about it. But at the same time, these very same officers, they rejected the implication that they were somehow not good enough to do the job that they did their whole lives. That they needed to be trained to patrol the border, which they had already been patrolling anyway. They were committed to protecting the national border, and they resented the idea that some bureaucrats from Brussels would teach them how to do that. So this tension has always been in the background, but for a good decade afterwards, the view that prevailed, at least officially, was that the Polish border ought to be governed as the external EU border that it is, in accordance with the technocratic model and in cooperation with the relevant EU agencies. And that started to change. That started to change around the time of the regime change in Poland in 2015. And in 2021, when the crisis on the Belarusian border began, the Polish government chose to frame the situation primarily in terms of the defense of the Polish national border, right? So this is this is the moment for me of a kind of a repoliticization of the border. So yeah, the EU was important insofar as it legitimized the actions of the Polish government, as it was kind of pushing back against Lukashenko's campaign. But fundamentally, this was framed as a war with Lukashenko over the Polish border, defended by the Polish guards and military, not European. And this is also why Frontex was not invited to assist in sort of resolving this crisis. The Polish Ministry of Interior announced early on in September of 2021 that it would be going it alone. And by October, according to the ministry sources, 7,500 border guards and troops were deployed to the border. And as they said, there was no need to call in supports. The only capacity in which Frontex was useful to the Polish authorities was the organization of removals. So, ferrying people by plane back to third countries, returning them home. Quite an expensive undertaking where Frontex's infrastructure and experience was useful. But it is also worth noting that the domestic critics of the Polish government, so basically representatives of the former government and the opposition party Civic Platform, they suspected that the reason Frontex was not invited was because the Polish authorities didn't want any external actors looking too closely at what they were doing. So the implication being that, I have a quote that I didn't get a chance to put it on the slide, but I have a quote from the sort of previous government's head of the border guard in Poland, who criticized the current leadership of the border guard for not inviting Frontex. And he said, quote, "There are two reasons why Frontex has not been invited. One of them is that we want to be seen as the sole savior of Europe. The other is that we don't want anyone to watch our hands. Since some time ago within Frontex, there is the role of Officer for Fundamental Rights. This post has been established due to improprieties during the operations on the Mediterranean." And so then the general went on to imply that the Polish border guard did not consider the fundamental rights of migrants its priority, and it did not wish to be questioned about its approach, and hence it was better to opt out of the EU's technocratic model of border control without sort of directly challenging it. But on the ground, right, when push came to shove at the border itself, in the forest, where the people were being pushed back, abandoned, and where, as we now know, many of them died, this tension between the national and supranational, the tension between compassion and repression, that really came to a breaking point, showing that this concept of border management that for 20 years dominated EU policy, that it's kind of increasingly unsustainable. And this is where the stark difference between the light touch enforcement of the Polish-Ukrainian border and the militarized Polish-Belarussian border becomes really significant. So the Polish-Belarussian border remained an off-limit zone where volunteers helping the migrants faced arrest for helping, just for the act of helping. And the Polish-Ukrainian border at the same time became a site of this vast mobilization of hospitality, of resources to welcome some 3.5 million people. At least initially, it was more later. It was, in many ways heartwarming to see these scenes of Ukrainians being welcomed, in Przemyśl and in other Polish cities in February and in March of 2022. But it was also difficult not to conclude that these two borders, right, reveal a racialized hierarchy where the hardship of Ukrainian women and children elicits solidarity, while the people from Iraq or Afghanistan are left in the forest to die. And these responses, like I said in the very beginning, to these two situations were disparate, but there was no contradiction. Rather, I see them as a new manifestation of the politics of compassion and repression that, that I already talked about. And so here is my slide with the Polish president, because it's also significant in this context that Polish authorities chose to exceptionalize the arriving Ukrainians, right? They didn't treat them as, they would any other refugees from any other part of the world. They made them exceptional by framing them in political discourse as guests rather than refugees. They were victims of war where the aggressor was Poland's historical foe, and it was the logic of war that dictated accommodating them, in a way, supporting the Ukrainian war effort. And so this is really captured quite nicely in this excerpt from the Polish president's speech. So I interpret this as Polish authorities engaging in what William Walters, the political sociologist, called domopolitics. And that is the projection that the state can be governed as a home, right? So Polish people were encouraged to see Ukrainians not as refugees, but as kin, right? As people who are sufficiently similar to the Poles that they can be welcomed into the home the way, people welcome friends and relations. This was kind of a rhetorical move that placed them beyond this technocratic realm of migration and asylum seeking and outside the legal and bureaucratic frames that are typically applied to these situations, right? So as Duda says, he says, "Dear Ukrainian friends, I would like you to know that your loved ones, wives, parents, children, grandchildren, the millions of people who had to leave Ukraine for Poland fleeing the tragedy of war, that today they are not refugees in our country, but rather they are our guests. As you so bravely fight in defense of your independence, they are safe in Polish homes, and they will be able to return safely to their fatherland after you defeat the Russian occupier." Right, so it's a very kind of clear positioning of it as really part of something quite different than border management. And so this exceptional status that they were granted on the basis of the politics of compassion, it gave them certain privileges, but those privileges are conditional in the long term. They are dependent on the shifting politics of the Polish and European response to the war in Ukraine, and indeed the kind of compassion fatigue that certainly begins to be felt in Poland after now that a year has passed since the original arrivals. So there was special legislation that was passed in Poland on assisting Ukrainian refugees that granted them, quite generous rights, more or less aligned with what the EU temporary protection directive, would expect anyway, but certainly more generous than anything that any other refugee group in Poland ever received. So that was originally passed in March 2022, but just this past December, it was amended And in the amendments introduced, among other things, a limit of 120 days on access to free accommodation for Ukrainian refugees. After 120 days, they will be required to, it will no longer be free. It will be subsidized to a certain degree, and some details of how it will be subsidized differently for different categories of people and different periods of time. So, this is already kind of a pulling back of some of the original rights. And as legal experts from this organization called the Association of Legal Intervention, they pointed out, this amendment contravenes the EU Temporary Protection Directive. So the refugees from the Middle East, Southeast and Central Asia and African countries, on the other hand, they were also, so on the one hand, I've talked about how the Ukrainians were granted this special privilege status. The refugees from the Middle East, Southeast and Central Asia and African countries were also kind of cast outside the ordinary legal order. But they were the kind of the abject other, and their objection was normalized through the long history of the politics of repression, and their dehumanization is no doubt grounded in fear and racism. But many people came to see it as even more justified within the context of Lukashenko's hybrid warfare. So if you accept the premise that people are not people, but weapons, the language of border management no longer makes sense, right? The border has been repoliticized and military defense becomes the logical response. So to conclude, on Poland's eastern border, in the shadow of the war in Ukraine in the spring of 2022, the tension between compassion and repression came to a breaking point. And I have tried to show how it exploded from within this already fragile technocratic fiction that EU's external borders can be managed in a way that's orderly and humane. What we have replacing this technocratic fiction is this new militaristic paradigm that is in fact already in place. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Karolina. So we have now a few moments to ask questions or enter the discussion. And while you think about your question that you can pose through this Q&A box below in your Zoom app, I have a question to start the ball rolling. So I am convinced, so I understand your explanation through this tension between politics of compassion and politics of control. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are, significant changes in the, so to speak, aesthetics or, the ways that this two politics were balanced or not balanced. And I think that's, that's the difference between the West and Poland as this twilight zone or ambiguous zone. Because if you think, about Latour and in terms of modernity hiding things, I would say, that the Poles were unable to hide some of the things and that pushes them away, from modernity. So I think, my question is, I'm not sure if you agree to this, but if you agree, can you maybe spell out more the difference? Because, you have, yeah.
Right. So okay, so the difference you want to like the difference in the aesthetics of expressing politics of repression
Yes,
between
yes,
Poland or Eastern Europe and the West.
yes. You know, when you talked about the rolling back of the politics of compassion,
Mm-hmm,
when the
mm-hmm,
120 days 120 days period
mm-hmm,
was introduced. For me,
mm-hmm,
that's the kind of a politics of compassion, or rolling back, or
mm-hmm,
hiding the politics of control
mm-hmm.
in a more invisible way, as opposed to building a fence.
Yeah, no, for sure, because it's, I think, if you want to think about it in kind of in terms of aesthetics and representation, the images were really so extreme in their contrast, right? And if you think back to a year ago, when on the one hand, the first bombs fell on Kiev, and the next day, the border between Poland and Ukraine was open, and you had, and this was broadcast, obviously 24/7 on Polish television, but also quite prominently abroad. There were people just crossing in a stream, women, children, teddy bears, everybody receiving hugs from members of the public and from the authorities, from the border guards, all that. And the contrast between that and and to showing, like, on the one hand, that contrast, because it's the same officers of the border guard who were, seen locking up families with children in police and like in the border guard van and driving off with them God knows where. The images of the children in muddy clothes and starving, and or mostly just being very, very cold. This was happening at the same time, and these images were exploited by different actors, right? Because on the one hand, the authorities use them to say, like, these are the good people, these are the bad people, and this is how we're good, and this is how we're rightfully defending ourselves from the bad. But these very same images were also being used by the human rights defenders, who were showing, like, oh, this is your hypocrisy. Why are these children good, and these children and families and people are being persecuted? But so we start off with this stark contrast, but along the lines, there was this persistent worry of particularly, and I'm talking here about the activists themselves, who are so close to the ground, who are experienced in, all this civil society work and geo work, and know how the Polish state functions and how it doesn't. And they were worried from the very beginning that this isn't going to hold, that, that precisely because the contrast was so stark, and precisely because the Ukrainian, the hospitality towards the Ukrainians was so exalted, that that wasn't sustainable, and that there was going to be a backlash, and that this backlash was going to start to happen pretty soon, because the more the Polish state was going to be, giving to them, the more resentful people were going to get. And so now, as what I'm seeing in terms of hiding, the situation on the Belarusian border is pretty much hidden from view. It's, it is true that the numbers are nowhere near as high as they were in 2021 or even early 2022. But as I said, people are still there and dying. Nobody's reporting on this anymore. But the focus is on the fact that, well, the Ukrainians, they've been here long enough, just this idea that the outstaying of welcome, and that the resources that have been shared with them, actually, maybe it's time to claw back a bit. So I think that's some of the, that, because in a way, it's like the higher the extremes, like the more rapid I think the shift can be. And it's also, I think, a sign of how deeply politicized this is, and how, you can never pretend that accommodating members of other groups, within a political community can be achieved in a kind of apolitical, technocratic, humane, calm, and orderly way. It's always going to generate tensions, even with kind of the best political will in the world. Did I go off?
No. So if you have questions, please post them. So I have another question. So how do you think what the dynamics that you described on the Polish border and those two borders, how do you think it impacts the EU border policies long lasting, or is this a turning point somehow? Because I recall the German interior minister coming to Warsaw and supporting this hostile policy towards migrants crossing the border from Belarus. I was wondering, is this a turning point? So we're going to be cruel now and, explicitly racist? Or is this, another stage of this balancing between policy of compassion and policy of control? And
I think I think the turning point was 2015. And in a way, we have been cruel, in different ways since then. And we certainly have been cruel before in yet other ways and on a smaller scale. And, there were, as I've been, studying this over a number of years, I definitely see a shift away from, talking about fundamental rights and a humane and orderly asylum system. And this is like, it's definitely receding into the rear view mirror, and it is kind of apart from, kind of the diehard European Commission Justice and Home Affairs people. Like, you don't hear as much of this rhetoric anymore because it has become repoliticized. But, because we all have our sort of blinders related to the regions we study, I think it is particularly important to pay attention to the Polish-Belarussian border, because it is now a geopolitically sensitive borderline. And because of the war in Ukraine, and because of the fact that we still don't know how it's going to unfold, and because it is going to be designated, and it has been by Poland and by the European Union as a kind of volatile security line. And so I think it will be militarized, and that will be justified in the war context. But in a way, my sense is that war or no war, the militarization of borders is a fact. And, it's here to stay.
We have a question from Sabine von Dierke. And the question is, what role does the rise of right-wing parties in several European nations play in terms of the rollback of a politics of compassion since 2015? And I think it's a very relevant question, since, the weight is, so to say, distributed across East and West, new and old. And
yeah, I mean, I think the role of the rise of right-wing parties is profound, because they have achieved the mainstreaming of hateful anti-immigrant rhetoric from something that was a little bit frowned upon and a little bit shameful, things like open racism. It has really, like, the kind of the spot of tolerance has shifted, right? And it is possible now to say by mainstream politicians things that would not have been, maybe not think they were always thinkable. Clearly people have thought them, but that were not sort of discussed in polite society in a way that they have been, since you can name a country and its own, crazy political party. In Poland, the rise of law and justice, and in the UK, it's a whole other story. Brexit, and I showed the image of Farage, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, where of course they did not gain power, but they exercised enough pressure to actually have an influence as well, and in many other countries. So I think it is like, I always do think that the role of political leadership is fundamental. That that it's a kind of that between what the public thinks it demands and then what the leaders respond to, this is exactly how the discourse changes and how it moves. So thank you for the question. I think it's key because from those pressures on more mainstream parties come more extreme policies.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think we arrived to our time is over. We arrived to the end of our meeting today. Thank you, Karolina, once again for your talk tonight or this evening.
Thank you, that was my pleasure.
Yes. So our next week's talk is from Oksana Shevel, and she will talk about identity, nation building, and the war in Ukraine. You can have a look at our webpage of the European Studies Center. The previous recordings from our Europe Today lecture series are there, and you can refer to them if you wish. Thank you, and see you next week.